to complete your quiz. I should probably go get something to eat. Hey, Abby and Crystal together. Cool. So like one more minute.
Abby, your dog looks really, really cute. Thank you.
All right, so it's just about that time. Hold on. Didn't manage to get enough food in me, so that's gonna make today's class super interesting. But I am excited to talk to you about the end of Orinoco. Let me just do a couple more things. So I have some grading to do for you guys, but it should be done soon. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, hold on. One more minute. One more minute. All right. Okay. So we're getting towards the end of the semester. There's only a couple days left. So we have like a 1 week of classes, and then your final paper will be due. Let's see. Sorry, I'm kind of running behind today. Okay, all right. All right. No, this one. Okay. So next class, Amber will present on American Women Poets, specifically Phyllis Wheatley and Anne Bradstreet. And then Victoria will present on Mary Rowlandson, who got captured by Native Americans and dragged around. And then, what, a week and a half from today, 2 weekends away, you'll write your final paper, which I told you about last class, 4 to 8 pages. Yeah, I'll be here on that Tuesday if you have questions or if you run into trouble. Okay. All right, so Brett was supposed to present today, but he is not feeling well. So we're gonna do this whole thing without him. That's part of the reason why I'm probably scrambling. Welcome, happy Friday, everyone. Let's talk about Orinoco. Oh crap, hold on one sec. I forgot to do my animations. I don't like, hold on. Just talk among yourselves for a minute. Or Abby, show us your dog some more.
Yeah, please.
What's his name?
Sullivan.
What is it?
Sullivan.
Nice.
That's adorable.
He's very fluffy right now and he doesn't get a haircut for another like 2 weeks.
That's what it actually looks like. Without the bangs.
Bangs.
All right.
Wait, spotlight.
Does everyone have plans for the weekend?
I'm grading.
I'm doing an early birthday celebration with my friends tomorrow because I turn 21 3 days after the semester's ends. So
Woo!
I wanted
Happy
to do
Happy
something.
birthday, Victoria.
Thank you.
What day?
May 15th.
15th. Mine's May
Yeah.
16th. Ugh, it was always kind of depressing because the semester would end and then I would have a birthday. All right. I'm almost ready to do this thing. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. I should be more prepared. It's that kind of a semester. It's that kind of a Friday. But Orinoco's super cool. So let's talk about it. So what were some of the big questions that kind of struck you guys about Orinoco and today's reading? Questions you had, kind of big issues. Whoops. I think that this is an important kind of text because it kind of shows a slavery outside of just the US and kind of talks about slave experiences even outside of the US and shows that it's kind of a America's thing rather than just a United States thing. Let me close the door to my office real quick. Okay, to review, remember Orinoco is an African prince and he fell in love with Imoinda and they had a whole kind of thing, but then she, there was drama with his grandfather and eventually she was sold into slavery, which Orinoco didn't know. He was told she was dead. Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, so I didn't realize when reading the first part of this, she's like 15.
I know, but I think he's 18. I think he's supposed to be around.
That's
18.
not the part that I'm worried about. Their
know.
relationship is fine. The weird old grandpa that wants to have sex with a 15-year-old. That's really, really creepy.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because he's like 99 or something, right? Yes. So she's real young. They're kind of like Afra Ben is kind of doing a Romeo and Juliet type thing, but in an interesting new way. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, today's reading we discover just how young she is. All right, so when we left off talking last class, Orinoco had been kind of lured onto a ship by some white guys, some British white guys, and they had captured him. And Ben kind of judges them pretty hard. So I'm going to kind of begin today by talking about Orinoco's experiences on the slave ship. So initially he plans to starve himself because he'd rather be dead than be a slave. And so the captain kind of lies and manipulates him and tells him he'll free him. Orinoco doesn't trust him, so he says, if you are really gonna free me, then like you should take me out of my fetters now and let me roam around the ship. And the captain like, the captain eventually complies, but ultimately sells Orinoco into slavery in South America, and thus proves himself dishonorable. Okay. And when they sell Orinoco and all his people, when they sell the slaves, they sell them up, they split them up, sell them among different plantations. This is a historically accurate strategy that they did to kind of prevent slave revolts. So Orinoco is put up for sale, and eventually is bought by this guy named Treffry. I can never say it. Treffry?
Audiobook said to fry.
Treffry.
Yeah.
That's good. Treffry. That's weird too, though. But yeah, I'm down with it as long as someone tells me how to pronounce it. Okay, Treffry. But his like exceptionalism and his royalty is like so inborn and apparent that everyone who looks at him like realizes that he's not a common slave, and he confesses he was above the rank of common slaves. And Treffry kind of treats him more like a host than a slave master. He kind of asks him his story. He doesn't actually make him work. He promises to return him to Africa, / his country in Africa. Orinoco is kind of, he has doubts, but he says like Treffry at least looks kind of trustworthy. But Treffry does rename him because apparently Orinoco is too hard for a white guy to say, and so he renames him Caesar. What do you guys think of that?
I mean, this entire part to me definitely felt like we've talked before about how the book is kind of against slavery, but this part feels very much so like it's trying to justify slavery or paint it in at least a better light than it was seen in.
Like not all the slave masters are terrible. There was some good masters, right?
Yeah.
Which is a problematic argument always, right? Like and even Orinoco is like, I don't care how good my master is, like I just cannot handle being a slave, right? Especially because like slave masters will do a thing, even if they don't make you work, they will rename you like a name that they prefer. He
it's
endured
also
no
like-
more of the slave but the name, but even then he can't handle it. Sorry, go ahead, Maddie.
Sorry, yeah, but it's like also, I'm talking about just the name, you're still considered someone else's property.
Exactly, right?
Humanize that aspect in general makes it not okay. And like this whole thing feels like justifying it, despite the fact that the
Does
book is
it?
commonly seen.
It could be, I guess it depends on how you see it. I always kind of, it's definitely problematic, but I always feel like Ben is kind of saying like, look, even if we don't make them work, the fact that we own them is like unlivable, right? Does that make sense? Maybe it's, Maddie, what you're responding to is that like Orinoco is kind of the exception. Maybe like, so like, yeah. Okay. When Orinoco gets to Treffry's plantation, he discovers all the other slaves are, surprise, from his country. In fact, he's the one that sold them into slavery. So this is a little bit uncomfortable, but they're not mad at him about it. And they're like, long live the king, and they kiss his feet. It's very weird. And then Orinoco hears about, I'm going to keep calling him Orinoco because he calls himself toward the end Orinoco, even though like Aphra Behn called him Caesar. So it might be worth kind of tracking all the ways that Aphra Behn, all the evidence that kind of indicates that Aphra Behn is kind of still racist or is making an apology or an explanation or kind of saying, well, slavery is okay, and all the evidence that supports the idea that she's challenging slavery, because I think she's still pretty split about it. She keeps calling him Caesar, but I'm going to call him Orinoco. Okay, so he hears about this beautiful female slave who also does not really work. Everyone's in love with her, even the white master, right? But she has remained unraped, which is totally historically accurate. And Orinoco even asks why Trefry doesn't just rape her, which is pretty problematic. That's around page 38. And Trefry says, well, you know, every time I try, like, she like cries and like, you know, it tries to get me to be a better man, and then I like resist, and like, so she like somehow enables the men around her to kind of be more moral. This is kind of a problematic gender thing that I kind of like noticed throughout, is like somehow like men are awful, and like women's job around is to like make them act like humans, to make them act like good people, to kind of instill them with morality and kind of encourage them to be moral. Imoinda, the slave that everyone is in love with, turns out to actually be Imoinda. Score. They are reunited, Orinoco and Imoinda, and they get married. And there's this one line where they're kind of like together, and they're newly together, and they say, even the fetters and slavery were soft and easy. I think I've misspelled some of these things, would be supported with joy and pleasure, while they could be so happy to possess each other. So basically, like, they found each other. So even slavery is okay and tolerable, but really only just for a minute or so. This is also where the author enters the story. She lives kind of on an adjacent plantation and had met Orinoco when Trefry was kind of coming down and introducing him around. So Imoinda and Orinoco get together, get married. She's soon pregnant, which made him the more impatient of liberty, as he was every day, treating with Trefry for his and Clemene's liberty. So basically, they're so happy they found each other. They have a moment where they're like, oh, you know, at least this has brought us together. But once she's pregnant, they're like, no more of this. Orinoco especially had been told by Trefry that he was going to free him. And so Orinoco's like, when? Like, let's go. Free me at least, even if you don't return me to Africa. Free my wife at least. And of course, Trefry keeps not doing that, keeps delaying. So what happens is that, like, the author, supposed to be supposedly Afra-Ben, or like a character kind of called Afra-Ben. She takes him exploring in South America to kind of distract him and to give him some exercise, so he stops obsessing about being a slave. Sometimes we go surprising and in search of young tigers in their dens, you know, just because that's what you do for fun. You go kind of pick a fight with a tiger. Then Orinoco kills a tiger mother, who switches between genders in a really interesting way. An electric eel almost takes him down, but he's saved by some Native Americans, and they eat it for dinner that night, and he had left. Okay, so like there's all these kind of fun like asides. They get to explore a Native American camp. There's some self-mutilation to show bravery and toughness in the Native American camp, but kind of Orinoco's a bit like horrified, and so are the white people. This kind of distraction lasts only about 3 months before Imoinda's pregnancy starts really showing. And that's when Orinoco starts like making plans and not relying on the white people anymore. Though he suffered only the name of a slave and had nothing of the toil and labor of one, yet that was sufficient to rend him uneasy. He's totally worried they are lying to him, and he is suspicious of them, which then in turn offends them because white people are the worst. They're worried that he's going to, you know, he's worried they're going to make his kid a slave. They're worried he's going to start a slave revolt. And so he does, he's like, well, if you're not going to do anything about it, if you're not going to hold your word, I'm leaving. The miseries and ignominies of slavery, they suffered not like men, but like dogs that loved the whip and bell. So what he does is all the slaves are kind of gathered to have like a meal together without very many white people around because it's Sunday. And he makes this big speech to them being like, look, these white people, they have totally dehumanized us. They've turned us into dogs that love the whip and bell. They've turned us into asses that haul their gear around. We need to reclaim our masculinity. We need to reclaim our humanity and get away from this plantation. It's a weird speech because it's like, it's not clear here. Let's look at it. It's not really clear in the speech whether Orinoco is dehumanizing people or whether he is pointing out how they have been dehumanized by whites. So this is page 52. 50, 51, and 52. Okay, so here is his speech. Anyone want to read it for us? It begins kind of right here, Caesar or Orinoco.
I can do it.
Thanks, Maddie.
Caesar, having singled out these men from the women and children, made a
Harangue.
harangue to them of the miseries and ignominies of slavery, counting up all their toils and sufferings under such loads, burdens, and drudgeries as were fitter for beasts than men, senseless brutes than human souls. He told them it was not for days, months, or years, but for eternity. There was no end to it. There was no end to be of their misfortunes. They suffered not like men who might find a glory in fortitude and oppression, but like dogs that loved the whip and bell, and fawned the more they were beaten. That they had lost the divine quality of men and were become insensible asses, fit only to bear, nay worse, an ass or dog or horse, having done his duty, could lay down and retreat and rise to work again. And while he did his duty to endure no stripes, but men, villainous, senseless men, such as they, toiled on all the tedious week till Black Friday. And then, whether they worked or not, whether they were faulty or meriting it, they promiscuously, the innocent with the guilty, suffered the infamous whip, the sword stripes from their fellow slaves, till their blood trickled from all parts of their body. Blood, whose every drop ought to be revenged with the life of some of those tyrants that impose it. And why, said he, my dear friends and fellow sufferers, should we be slaves to an unknown people? Have they vanquished us nobly in fight? Have they won us in honorable battle? Are we, by the chance of war, become their slaves? This would not anger a noble heart. This would not animate a soldier's soul. No, but we are bought and sold like apes or monkeys to be the sport of women, fools and cowards, and the support of rogues, renegades that have abandoned their own countries for rapine, murders, thefts, and villainies.
Okay, good. You're good. That was a lot. Thank you, Maddie. All right, what do you think, guys? What do you think of Orinoco's speech to others?
He's very well read, obviously.
He knows a billion languages. He's very well read rhetorically. What do you think? Do you think that he is dehumanizing them, or is he pointed out how white people dehumanize them worse?
I mean, I think he's pointing out how white people are dehumanizing them without cause to dehumanize them. Like, he talks about how it's how they haven't been beaten or in battle or lost a fight or anything. They just like captured them completely senselessly. There was no actual honor in it.
Exactly. And so like his kind of idea is like, look, like some forms of slavery maybe like he kind of is like kind of drawing a spectrum of slavery. And he's saying like some slavery is more honorable or justifiable or understandable. So like if you beat someone in battle, like you know that they're like worthy, and thus like there's some kind of honor or something in actually serving them. But if you just capture people through deception and buy and sell them based on the color of their skin, this is the worst and most dehumanizing form of slavery. And so like it's an interesting argument to make. It's an argument that's kind of like maybe addressing the kind of argument or the kind of comment that people still make. Well, you know, they had slaves in Africa too, thus it must be okay what we did. The kind of people like the kind of like all slavery is awful and should be outlawed, but like, do you think there are degrees of slavery that like are worse and more dehumanizing, right? And Orinoco definitely kind of feels like there are. And it seems like Ben is also kind of pointing out like, just because they have slaves in Africa, that doesn't make it equal to what we do to slaves in the Americas. Does that make sense? Yeah. I kind of like it for this. I think Afra Ben is pretty smart / enlightened kind of to have like thought of this. Maybe I'm kind of giving her more credit than she deserves, but like here we are bought and sold like apes or monkeys to be, you know, the sport of women, fools, and crowds. Like he's kind of saying like, you know, there's no way of getting out of this. We are not even seen as human by these people. These people are totally untrustworthy. And also, by the way, their own countries pretty much kicked them out. And so basically like they're the worst of the worst. They're criminals. And, you know, there's no reason why we should be, you know, happy serving them. And also their weapons are shit, is what he says a little later. Okay, so there's no honor in this kind of slavery. And, you know, there's no honor in being slaves to a race without honor, right? It's definitely different than the kinds of slavery practiced in Africa. Orinoco convinces, you know, his people to work toward a slave revolt. And by revolt, I really mean they just kind of take off, which is pretty good. This is one of the more peaceable revolts in history, right? So he convinces them that they're going to leave, that they got to leave for the sake of their wives and children, who they'd also take with them. And they're going to go make their own colony and settlement of freed slaves and Africans. How did you feel when you were kind of reading this? Is this like a good, reasonable, realistic? What do you think? Admirable? Is it naive?
I mean, I'd say it's both admirable and naive because you can't, obviously they chase them down and like take them back and the consequence is much worse.
Mhm.
It's at the same time like admirable that they didn't immediately resort to violence.
Right? They just kind of left. They didn't
especially like in the
kill
face
all
of
the white
everything that they
people.
were.
Yeah, right. In fact, it may have been more successful if they had been a bit more cruel, right? And killed all the white people. But Orinoco doesn't see all white people as evil. He kind of likes the white women. He kind of thinks they're kind of cool because they kind of also see him as human. So there's a kind of interesting kind of rapport kind of being developed between white women and Black men, right? They kind of recognize the humanity in each other and the ways that white men are kind of maybe dehumanizing each other. Okay, so they take off through the mountains, they cut down all the forest and burn it. Go ahead, Crystal.
Sorry, this is kind of a late thought, but it just popped in my head. When you say that like they didn't mind the white women, do you think that has something to do with like the fetishization, the word you know I'm trying to say? Do you think that it has to do with that fetishization?
I think it probably a little bit. Yeah. Don't forget, like, this is all fiction. Like, so like it's, or at least it's really not clear what's fact. Right. And so, but it's not that much of a, go ahead, Maddie, help me out here.
I think it also has to do a lot with the solidarity that we a lot of times see formed, especially historically, between white women and Black men.
I'd like to see it that way anyway. Like,
because it's like,
yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead, keep going. Sorry.
Because it's like obviously both groups are marginalized in a sense. Like women are obviously oppressed by religion and society, and then Black men are taken as slaves. Straight up, just like you're not actually human.
Right.
Um,
They're both forms of property during this period.
yeah, and it tends to form a solidarity between the two, despite the fact that like, sorry, I lost it.
The reason I think it might not be fetishization as well is because even though the author is very admiring of Orinoco's looks, there doesn't ever seem to be any kind of sexual, like his looks are just kind of evidence of how amazing and exceptional and heroic and awesome he is, and rather than like, and then she wanted to get with him. Like the author seems very respectful of Orinoco and Imawinda's kind of relationship too. And so that's why I kind of see it as more like Maddie was saying, kind of like a solidarity kind of moment of like mutually recognized humanity despite the oppressor, or in the face of the oppressor. Yeah. So it's really easy for the white people to follow Orinoco because like they have to cut down the trees and burn the forests. At some points, it's very obvious that Orinoco is an 18-year-old. Right? Because you're like, Orinoco, why are you like making it so obvious? Like, but he really expects his people, when the white people kind of catch up, he really expects kind of a glorious battle. So he doesn't care that they even know that where they've gone. And he's kind of like relishing, you know, the ability to kind of like teach them some, you know, teach them some humility, but it doesn't work out that way for him because all of the people that he convinced to kind of escape with him kind of just surrender.
Is that dude in the corner holding a human head?
Oh yeah. So this is a slave revolt. So here's the white people and here are the people, you know, the former slaves fighting. So this is a historical representation of the slave revolt. And yeah, yep. He's like, look, I got your commander. So this is what Orinoco's imagining, but what happens is like when the white people catch up, like the former slaves kind of surrender without putting up much of a fight. Orinoco and Imawinda stand and fight. She even shoots the governor by him in the shoulder with a poisoned arrow. Unfortunately, he's got a Native American mistress who sucks out all the poison, right? And Orinoco says like, you're never going to take me alive. There's no faith in the white men or the gods they adored. And this is a pretty revolutionary statement, especially because like Ben seems to have invented it herself for the sake of this story. And also then Orinoco says that he is ashamed of what he had done in endeavoring to make those free who are by nature slaves, dogs, treacherous and cowardly, and they were fit for such masters. So this is a little problematic. 56. So so I actually think it, yeah, right here. So like they're kind of like, how could you have done this, run away with your pregnant wife? And he's like, the only mistake I made was to try to free these other people, because obviously they are so cowardly that they should be slaves by nature. This is pretty problematic, right? Tell me about this.
I mean, he totally just flips the switch. He like kind of goes from saying you should only be slaves if you're like defeated in battle or if it's like honorable.
Mhm.
And then they surrender like for battle. And he's just like, oh, well, they should have been slaves anyway.
Well, it kind of fits. It kind of fits the thing. Like, if you're not going to put up a fight, then you deserve to be a slave. But like, he totally like also like abandons like any other reasoning, like any other kind of form of values. Does that make sense? Like, he doesn't recognize like fear. He doesn't recognize how someone may be without all of his privileges. Remember, he wasn't really made to work. He was never beaten. He was just kind of called a slave, he neglects to realize or to kind of account for this whole machine of slavery, right? And also his own culpability. He's the one that sold them as slaves in the first place, right? It's no wonder they don't want to go help him and live with him, and you know. So Orinoco remains, for me at least, a complicated hero, to say the least. Anyway, Byam somehow tricks them into surrendering, really, because he wants revenge. Okay. So Orinoco had been resolved. There's all these places throughout the story where Orinoco's resolved to die rather than submit to this kind of dishonor. And he almost never actually follows through with that. Do you think that that's problematic? Do you think it takes away from his heroism? What do you think?
I mean, I would say more than anything, it just shows his age.
His immaturity.
Yeah.
And maybe also like a desire to live, even like in spite of honor. Does that make sense? Like, you can say I'm gonna die rather than go back to slavery, but like you can always escape from slavery and you can't really escape from death, right? The fallout. When they get back to the plantations, they whip all the slaves and especially Orinoco. You guys know this picture? This is Gordon's slave. The slave named Gordon, sorry. And this is scar tissue, a lattice of scar tissue on his back from a whipping. Now the narrator says that when Orinoco and his people kind of escaped into the woods, they were possessed with extreme fear that Orinoco would secure himself till night and then that he would come down and cut all our throats. And so here's one instance where maybe solidarity and the mutual recognition of each other's humanities has reached its limit. Once they're fine with Orinoco kind of, and they recognize his humanity as long as he's isolated from other slaves and kind of biding his time. But once he actually gets free, they kind of racism of the system, kind of the racism of the culture that they're living in kind of overshadows any kind of sympathy. And they're afraid that, Orinoco is going to murder them all. And so they leave, all the white women leave. And this is why they didn't interfere before Orinoco got whipped, or at least this is the explanation that she gives. What do you think of this?
I mean, I don't think there would really have been any difference in how it played out if they had tried to interfere.
Okay. So one famous kind of analysis of Orinoco is that in the second part, whenever the women are not around, specifically also whenever the narrator's not around, that's when the worst acts of atrocity, that's when the worst violence is committed. And so there's a kind of, I don't know, she's almost culpable here, right? If she had stayed, maybe the men would not have gone as far. So I don't know. Okay. Orinoco decides to get revenge. What is his revenge?
He's gonna kill his wife and then buy him.
Yep. And then all the white people and then himself, right? Orinoco's revenge. No, I would not. So he says, he tells the white people, I would not kill myself even after a whipping, but will be content to live with that infamy till I have completed my revenge. And then you shall see that Orinoco scorns to live with the indignity that was put on Caesar. He takes him out into the woods and he tells her his design, first of killing her and then his enemies and then next himself, and the possibility of escaping. So he refuses to live with this anymore, but he also doesn't want his beloved wife and his child to live in slavery. So he takes them into the woods and that's his plan. His plan is to kill her. And when he tells her this, she's like, yeah, let's go. I'm ready. So he kills her. It's really kind of crazy. If you look at page 61. 61. Okay. All right. it's tough to read. I don't know about you, but it felt pretty tough to read. It says like, you know, the victim lays herself down before the sacrificer, while he, with a hand resolved and a heart breaking within, gave the fatal stroke, first cutting her throat and then severing her yet smiling face from that delicate body, pregnant as it was with the fruits of tenderest love. And as soon as he had done, he laid the body decently on leaves and flowers, of which he had made a bed. Only her face he left yet bare to look on, but when he found that she was dead, his grief swelled up to rage. Yeah. So he immediately kind of regrets it. Okay. So he kills his pregnant wife, his heavily pregnant wife. What do you think? Who does it remind you of? How is this different? Was it hard to read?
Yeah, I found this really difficult to read. I had to look up a couple sources just to understand what was going on most of the time.
And like when he killed her, it's like it happens pretty fast, right? Like it's just kind of done, and then like there's much more attention kind of devoted to his psychological reaction to it rather than the actual act. What do you
Yeah.
think of that?
It kind of reminded me of Othello.
Totally, right? Yes. Killing your wife? Definitely.
Yeah, and also not really wanting to do it, but feeling like you have to.
Yes, yes. And also a black man killing his wife, right?
And it also
Yeah,
began-
and they both begin with an O.
They both what?
Begin with an O.
Begin with a no?
An O.
Othello
Oh,
and
oh,
Anne.
yeah, yeah. I was like, a note? A no? Sorry. Yeah. Orinoco, Othello.
Also-
Similar.
They're both classified as honor killings.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
big-
Yes. It might be worth kind of doing 21.2 or no, 23.3. Hold on. It might be worth kind of with all the list of what you guys just said, like it might be worth kind of, I have compare and contrast Orinoco and Shakespeare's Othello. Specifically given each character is a black man who murders his wife. What's similar? You guys kind of, you know, gave me a whole bunch of reasons. So let's write them down. So you have them in case you want to compare and contrast Othello and Orinoco in perhaps a final paper. All right, so go to day 23, discussion 23.2, the second one. And think about, you know, what's similar. We talked about how both names started with O, they're both black men, they're both honor killings, they're both killing their wives. They both feel like they have no choice. What else? Is that it? Is that what we were kind of?
I mean, there's also a distinct similarity between Orinoco and Othello, in they're both, I don't want to say like upheld by white society, but they're both seen by white society as like the tamer version of the black man.
Okay, yes. Okay, so they're both seen by whites as an ally, would you say? Or
I wouldn't
asset?
necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but like, you know, Othello is classified, a lot of times they talk about how he's not like other Moors. He's like more well-read and everything, and that's kind of the same way that Orinoco is presented.
Mhm. So they're
More Eurocentric.
yeah. They're more Euroized or whitened. They're more quote unquote civilized. Like they're what white people see as more civilized black men, problematically, racistly. Right? Yeah. Okay. So what's different? Before you get to the other stuff about like what does race and gender have to do with all this? What's different about Orinoco killing Imoinda and Othello killing Desdemona?
Othello killed Amonda, or He did
I
not.
know.
Othello killed
Des.
Desdemona. Names. Othello killed Desdemona because he thought she was cheating on him. It was more of a personal honor killing than like societal honor.
Well, it was to protect other men, right? He even
Yeah.
says, like, I have to do this, else she'll deceive other men.
Yeah, and Orinoco's killing is very obviously to protect her. So
Her.
that's who they're protecting and who the honor is.
And so in that way, it's kind of he's trying to protect her because of her race, right? Does that make sense? So Othello kind of identifies with other men regardless of race. So he kind of identifies with men kind of writ large, whereas Orinoco kind of identifies, it seems, with other blacks, African diaspora, right? And so in that way is like he kills her for protection. Maybe part of it is because Imoinda is black as well as Othello and Desdemona is white. What do you think?
I mean, I think that has a lot to do with it. Obviously, like both these characters are very much so created by white writers.
True.
But like Othello is the only black character in his entire show, and he very much so caters to white supremacy and to a white society, whereas Orinoco,
Patriarchy, yeah.
while he's trying to figure out like the differences, because like obviously he's being newly introduced to the differences and to white supremacy in general, is still catering to black people, leading the uprising and everything.
Or at least trying to, right? So like their whole idea of honor, like Othello is like honor means like kind of upholding the system, that wives kind of belong to their husbands, and like Orinoco is kind of challenging maybe white supremacy, white patriarchy. Maybe kind of comparing these two texts shows like the extra level that of difficulty kind of sustained by interracial couples.
I think like we're all trying to write all of this down right now, which is why nobody's responding.
That's okay. I'm also just kind of thinking out loud, so don't worry. Sorry, I will stop talking so you can do your thing. Okay, take like another minute or two. Good. I think Abby raises a really good point in her post about how like maybe by comparing and contrasting Aphra Behn's Orinoco with Shakespeare's Othello, we can see how Shakespeare feeds into and perpetuates, maybe even kind of begins to cement or introduce stereotypes of Black men as violent. Whereas Aphra Behn is kind of, instead of kind of showing Black men as violent, she kind of shows instead kind of how slavery twists and perverts and pollutes love, right? Into something that only allows for violence, right? And so how does a hero respond to being enslaved. Like that's kind of the problem of Orinoco. And the problem is like the violence turns inward on the beloved, right? Onto the pregnant wife, onto the unborn child. Okay. All right. So the act is pretty heart-wrenching. And then I get really frustrated with Othello because what happens? He's too grief-stricken to actually follow through with his plan, right? So he kills her, he lays her on some flowers, but is too grief-stricken to actually get up and go after the oppressors. So all he does is he lays in the woods crying for like days. And then by the time the white people show up, he's too weakened to actually kind of take them down. They find him and try to threaten him, and he cuts out a chunk of his neck and throws it at them to show he's not afraid of death. He's just like heartbroken because of Imawinda. Anyone else super frustrated with this?
I mean, this is a common theme like throughout the novel. He just kind of like whenever grief he gets overwhelmed by grief and just kind of lays down and does absolutely nothing.
Yes. Yep. He didn't realize how much the loss of Imawinda would kind of incapacitate him. And this is another kind of piece of evidence, the kind of the women around kind of inspire heroism in Orinoco, and also inspire humanity and at least a little bit less cruelty in the white people, right? Okay, so the novella ends. So like Orinoco eventually gets captured by Byam and his posse. They bring him back. The women kind of nurse Orinoco back to life, and get his story. But then the narrator has to leave, and she also got sick and she had to go somewhere else. And while she's not around, Byam ties Orinoco to a post, mutilates him, cuts off his, nose, ears, genitals, and then burns him alive. And the whole time Orinoco doesn't scream or seem upset at all. He's just sitting there smoking a pipe. And so that is what happens to Orinoco. Thus died this great man, worthy of a better fate and a more sublime wit than mine to write his praise. Yet I hope the reputation of my pen is considerable enough to make his glorious name to survive to all ages, with that of the brave, the beautiful, and the constant Imawinda. Aphra-Behn, or the character, we can think of as Aphra-Behn, is unable to kind of save Orinoco from, the horrors of slavery, the cruelty and the barbarism of slavery. So she says this multiple times. She says basically if Orinoco had been white, lots of people would have written about him and his heroism. He would have been known worldwide. But because he was Black, his misfortune was to fall into an obscure world that afforded only a female pen to celebrate his fame. He liked the company of us women much above the men, even though he makes fun of Christianity and stuff like that. Another instance where gender is doing some really weird things in the text, it might be worth looking at, is the tiger scene on page 44. This is so weird. Okay, let's read it. 44. All right. So this is when they go kind of hunting tigers. Once we went on this design, Caesar was with us. He had no sooner stolen a young tiger from her nest, but going off, we encountered the dam, or mother, bringing a buttock of a cow, which he had torn off with his mighty paw. So here we have a masculine mother, a masculine tiger mother, and going with it toward his den, we had only 4 women, Caesar and an English gentleman, brother to this guy, the great Oliverian. We found there was no escaping this enraged and ravenous beast. However, we women fled as fast as we could from it, but our heels had not saved our lives if Caesar had not laid down his cub. When he found the tiger quit her prey to make the more speed toward him, and taking Mr. Martin's sword, you know, he kind of like basically protects everyone. Caesar met this monstrous beast of might, size, and vast limbs, who came with open jaws upon him, and fixing his awful stern eyes upon those of the beast, and putting himself into a very steady and good aiming posture of defense, ran his sword quite through his beast down to his very heart, home to the hilt of the sword. The dying beast stretched forth her paw, and going to grasp his thigh, surprised with death in that very moment, did him no other harm than fixing her long nails in his flesh very deep, feebly wounded him, but could not grasp the flesh to tear off any. When he had done this, he hollered to us to return. Oh, so this is so weird. When we finally returned, you know, we found him lugging the sword from the bosom of the tiger, who laid in her blood on the ground, and he took up with the cub and he gave it to the, you know, the author. So here's a weird scene where there's this tiger that kind of is both masculine and feminine. Go ahead, Maddie.
Yeah, I kind of interpret, because I noticed this while I was reading, and I kind of interpreted it as like, at first the tiger is presented as male when he's like attacking and threatening them, but once Oronogo gets that killing hit in, it's presented as female. So once the tiger is weakened, it's presented as female.
And that's what the kind of you know, the note, you know, right? Where is it? The very jarring mixture of pronouns in the 2 episodes of the tigers may suggest reluctance to use a feminine pronoun in moments of extreme violence. However, Jacqueline Pearson in 1991 suggests that the tiger represents nature, conceived as female when strong and aggressive, turning male when defeated. The first account went uncorrected in all 4. You know, like, this is totally a weird hermaphroditic kind of tiger who kind of, it's interesting. I just think, you know, it's a really interesting bit of symbolism, especially since it's a mother trying to protect her child, right? Cub, right? And at the end we have Imawinda, you know, pregnant. Even at this point in the play, she's pregnant, but at the end, Oronogo kills a pregnant Imawinda. All right. I wanted to kind of ask you guys, do you know anything about the history of slave revolts? Have you like heard of any slave revolts?
So I know of slave revolts, but only the ones that are like more focused in American history.
Mhm.
Um,
None of which were successful, right?
none of which were successful. They're actually much more unsuccessful, because the last and most prominent one, name of whom I cannot remember, who was led by a reverend, was actually the slave revolt that led to a law being introduced that that outlawed teaching reading and writing to slaves.
Mhm. Right. So in America, we have this kind of legacy of, oh no, slaves couldn't have revolted. It just made things worse. And I feel like I kind of have inherited that, and I kind of bring it to my reading of Oronogo. And that actually it's perpetuated maybe by white supremacy in America and in general. But actually there were successful slave revolts. And the most famous successful slave revolt is Haiti. Did you know Haiti was owned by France and full of white plantation owners, and the slaves there got together and overthrew and butchered all the whites, and they took over and they made their own country? Let's watch a video about it. And then you can start to answer, you know, 23.1, consider the historical reality of slave revolts. How does Ben's narrative justify slave revolts? Does the character see them as unjustified? Does the character kind of think of them as good or bad? Like how like, what do you think of the slave revolt here? Is the narrator sympathetic to Oronogo when he's leading the slave revolt? And what does this character think about white people in general? And then finally, what is the gender difference between white people, or how are white people portrayed differently than white men? So kind of think about those questions, and I'm going to show you a clip about Haiti. Haitian slave revolt. So you can watch like this 3-minute history, but there's a really good mini series called Black in Latin America, kind of put on by Henry Louis Gates Jr. And he kind of, Haiti and the Dominican Republic are on the same island, and he kind of compares and contrasts them and how Blackness is seen on the two islands.
In the countryside just outside Cap Haitien sits Bois Cayman, the forest of the alligator.
Sorry.
Today, it's just a modest village. There's nothing here to commemorate the momentous events that took place more than 200 years ago. Not even a plaque. This is where the Haitian Revolution was conceived, a revolution that would result in the creation of the first free Black republic on earth. And it all began with a Vodou religious ceremony held on this very spot. Anthropologist Rachel Beauvoir, who is Max Beauvoir's daughter, has researched the events of that night using oral accounts passed down for generations.
Rochelle, August 14th, 1791. It's midnight. Tell me what happened here under the street.
Thunder, lightning. The whole place is trembling. The earth seems to shake. And that's when they get together in this voodoo ceremony. And everyone together says, it's over, slavery's over. They did a sacrifice of an animal, which was a black pig. And this sacrifice, everyone touched the blood. And this was the sacred oath that above everything, liberty was most important.
The Haitian slaves confronted one of the most powerful nations on earth. For Black slaves to have the wherewithal to overthrow their white colonial masters was unthinkable. The principles of the French and American revolutions inspired many of the leaders. Many of the slaves drew their strength from the pride in their African past, expressed in the belief in the power of Vodou.
What was the role of Vodou in the revolution?
Vodou represented the cement that got all of those slaves coming from so many different areas. The continent of Africa. Haiti is like a microcosm of Africa.
And the glue was
And the glue was Vodou, making sense of it all and making everyone make sense of every other one. And then they had the unity necessary to have the most powerful slave revolution in the whole world.
All right. So that's a little bit more about voodoo than, probably is needed for this particular. Here's this one.
Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the Americas in the 18th century due to the production of products like coffee, tobacco, and cotton. But because of the importation of slaves, very distinct and often hostile ethnic groups lived side by side. There were around 20,000 whites, divided between the wealthy planters and the less powerful petits blancs, teachers, merchants, and the likes. And although the petits blancs were largely loyal to France, the planters favored independence because it would allow them to export their crop to more countries rather than just to France. Otherwise, there were 30,000 free persons of color, many of which were mixed race and lived in the South. Some of them went on to own slaves themselves and had more power than the petits blancs. However, they lacked some rights within the French system, so like the planters, they were largely pro-slavery and pro-independence. But the bulk of the population was made up of 500,000 slaves, which lived in notoriously bad conditions. And they often rose up, for instance, in 1759, some poisoned their masters as part of the Mackendal Rebellion. Plus, many slaves, known as Maroons, managed to escape the plantations and lived in the mountains. Tensions between these groups escalated when the French Revolution broke out and the population had to choose between independence, monarchy, republicanism, slavery, etc. And in 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Men also brought up the citizenship question. This is because slavery was not banned outright, and voting rights were later also granted to property owners, meaning petits blancs could not vote, but many free persons of color could. So in early 1791, some petits blancs seized Port-au-Prince, forcing the French to send thousands of troops to the island to restore order. Meanwhile, Vincent Auge, a free person of color, returned from France, hoping to force the colonial government to grant the right to vote to all free black men. This was rejected, so with around 300 men, he led an unsuccessful rebellion in late 1790 around Cap Francois. Meanwhile, as all this was going on, many slaves were able to escape and join the Maroons. And in August, outside Cap Francois, many Maroons met and held a secret voodoo service. There, they selected their leaders to start a slave rebellion, including Georges Biassou and Jean-Francois Papillon. And just a week later, the rebellion began. Within just a couple months, the slave army grew to tens of thousands, and they destroyed hundreds of plantations and killed thousands of whites. And in the chaos, the free persons of color, now led by André Rigaud, also led a small rebellion in the south demanding the right to vote. The French Revolutionary government sent Sotonax to the colony to try and restore order in 1792. He successfully made an alliance with Rigaud and began talks with the new rebel slave leader, Toussaint Louverture. But in early 1793, the situation changed drastically. The French beheaded King Louis and went to war against most of Europe. So the British Navy prevented supplies from reaching the island, and the Spanish began arming the slave rebels in the north. Plus, the colonists became split once again on issues like republicanism and independence.
Okay, so that's kind of enough, but we're very conditioned, I feel, to kind of think about slavery as inescapable. But there have been successful slave revolts. There have been people who successfully escaped slavery in the past. And that means that kind of Ben's kind of decision to end this with Orinoco's execution, pretty graphic execution, is a deliberate choice. And so, why did she make that choice? think about it as you start to answer 23.1, which asks you, what is the view of slave revolts here? Are they justified? Is she pro slave revolts? Is she scared of slave revolts? Does she think that that's not how we should go? Is she kind of more like white people should stop enslaving people and then they wouldn't have to revolt? Or is she more like white people should stop enslaving people like Orinoco, who are obviously heroic and not like other Black people? So she's kind of like not against slavery exactly, more like against Orinoco's slavery. Or is she kind of creating the character of Orinoco to kind of show that slavery is horrible and twists love and makes heroes into murderers and, baby killers?
So I don't know if anybody else felt this while reading, but I feel like she's not necessarily condemning slavery outright, but is instead condemning the sort of slavery that was employed in Suriname and most of the world, obviously.
The Americas, yeah.
Yeah, and like the Americas and other places that she witnessed where it was overly brutalized. And is like, instead of like condemning it outright, is saying, hey, if you're going to hold human beings as property, don't, dehumanize them and brutalize them to the point of this, because that's not getting anything done.
Especially all like the kind of ways that she says like white people are the worst, specifically white men are the worst, is kind of what she says a lot. Like, if women were there, this would never have happened, or yeah. I'm also not sure she's convinced that slavery itself is terrible, but I do kind of think that like this kind of text shows that like the kinds of slavery that she witnessed while in Suriname is horrible and should stop. Right. And she a bunch of times says like, oh, it's really too bad that, England has lost Suriname. She's kind of pro-colonialism. She's kind of like, that's such a nice place. It's really too bad they lost it to the Dutch. It's too bad we lost it to the Dutch, because I really liked it there. It's a nice place and there's tons of gold and stuff like that. So she's not exactly anti-imperialist, but she does seem that there are parts of this text that seem pretty critical of certain kinds of imperialism. Go ahead, Maddie.
This is kind of unrelated, but something you said made me think about it. Another thing that I noticed is her distinct lack of recognition of the Black women who were enslaved. Because obviously, there's Nemoinda, sorry.
Yeah.
But she talks, in that one part, it was like, if the women were there, it would never happen. But there were women there.
I know.
They were just enslaved women.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And I think that is a blind spot here. Like the only woman of color who gets named is Imawinda, and she seems like pretty unrealistic, right? Of of women in general, and of the power able to be exerted by women of color. Like, would she still have been worthy of Orinoco if she had been raped? Like, the author doesn't have to kind of address that, because luckily she manages to talk her way out of getting raped constantly, even though she's the most beautiful woman ever. It's like, what an impossible standard to live up to, right? If you're a woman of color. Okay, so there's tons of stuff here. If you wanted to compare Orinoco to Blazing World, if you wanted to compare Orinoco to Othello, even The Tempest, or if you want to compare The Tempest to Blazing World. For next class, we're actually going to be reading Phillis Wheatley, who is a Black woman, American, taken from Africa as a slave and enslaved up here in Massachusetts, and then eventually freed. So we'll be seeing kind of what she has to say. And Anne Bradstreet is white, and a little later, and yeah, they're not, yeah. Okay. All right. So I will talk to you Tuesday. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.